Well, I'd like to welcome everybody today to Defenders of Wildlife's celebrating 25 years of Mexican gray wolves back in the wild. Today is the second of a number of events that we are participating in during the silver anniversary of the Mexican gray wolf reintroduction to the wild. My name is Brian Bird. I am the director of the Southwest program at Defenders of Wildlife. We are located here in the headquarters office in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is the unceded lands of many Pueblo Native Americans, as well as Jicarilla Apache. We are excited today to be participating in the silver anniversary, the 25 years of coexisting with Mexican gray wolves. In the Southwest program here of Defenders of Wildlife, we have 3 states we work in. We have 7 staff. We're in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. We have about 2 to 3 staff in each of those states, and we work on all kinds of wildlife issues ranging from state and federal policy to wildlife connectivity and corridors to species recovery. We work on exciting wildlife such as the Mexican gray wolf, the jaguar, the ocelot, the pinon jay, the golden-cheeked warbler, and a number of other less charismatic animals and plants. So we are prolific in the Southwest. Today, you're going to hear from Craig Miller, who I will introduce in a minute. And again, 2023 marks the 25th anniversary of the reintroduction of the Mexican gray wolf, or Lobo, into the wild in the American Southwest. Predator eradication efforts nearly wiped them out, but through careful management and captive breeding with a reintroduction program, the Lobos have been restored to parts of their former range in the southwestern US and Mexico. We are nowhere near close to recovering this animal at an ecological level. And Craig will talk a little bit about the shortcomings, but we're also celebrating today. We're celebrating 25 years, and we're celebrating that the wolves have reached a record number in the wild in the US, 241 wolves in Arizona and New Mexico at the end of 2022. But again, the work is not done. And in order for the Mexican gray wolf to thrive and roam freely in the wild where they belong, we have much more work to do and other things to achieve. But we are celebrating a bit today. And today's event with Craig Miller is going to be one of a number of events that we are participating in as part of the Lobo Coalition, or MexicanWolves.org. This is the second in a series. The next one will be celebrating 25 years of Mexican gray wolves back in the wild at the Phoenix Zoo. So that's going to be March 25th from 10 to 2 p.m. Mountain Standard Time at the Stone House at the Phoenix Zoo. So if you're in Phoenix, Scottsdale area, please go on the 25th to the Phoenix Zoo and go to the Stone House, where we will be live. We'll have Craig Miller, who you're going to hear from today, and we'll have Michael Robinson from the Center for Biological Diversity. We're also going to be doing a number of film screenings at that event, which will be really exciting. The next event after that is March 28th at the Shrine of Ages Auditorium at the South Rim of the Grand Canyon National Park. That event is hosted by the Grand Canyon Wolf Recovery Project, and it will feature Sunny Dooley, who's a Diné Navajo storyteller, talking about the traditional storytelling of the Navajo and how they portray the wolf in their storytelling. So again, that's March 28th at the Shrine of Ages Auditorium. The next event will be on March 29th at 3 p.m. on Zoom, hosted by the Wolf Conservation Center and the Rain Coast Conservation Center. And it'll be Reagan Downey, the Director of Education at the Wolf Conservation Center. The next event will be March 30th at the University of New Mexico here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, at the University Student Union Building. That event is hosted by New Mexico Wild, UNM Wild, and the Lobos of the Southwest. And there'll be Sally Paez from the New Mexico Wild, Dave Parsons from Project Coyote and the Rewilding Institute, myself from Defenders of Wildlife, and Michael Robinson from the Center for Biological Diversity. Two more events. April 12th, on Zoom, there will be a Center for Biological Diversities and Lobo for Southwest event. That'll have Philip Hedrick, who is Professor of Emeritus at Arizona State University, and Michael Robinson, focusing on genetics and other challenges to wolf recovery. So that'll be very interesting. 25 years of Lobos back in the wild on April 13th at the Little Toad Creek Brewery. I believe that's in Silver City. That's hosted by the Center for Biological Diversity and the Upper Gila Watershed Alliance. And it'll feature Michael Robinson speaking again. So that we have a whole series of events. We're really excited to celebrate 25 years of Mexican gray wolf back on the ground. And again, the next event is Saturday, the 25th at the Phoenix Zoo. So today I'm really excited to welcome Craig Miller. I really am happy because one of the things that's unique about Defenders of Wildlife is that we have been with the Mexican wolf recovery effort since the very beginning. Craig Miller in particular, who's been with Defenders of Wildlife a long time, was working on this issue before there were wolves on the wild, so longer than 25 years. So Defenders of Wildlife has been there all along, and we're very unique because we're on the ground working with people and state agencies and federal agencies and tribes that actually live in the wolf country and are trying to coexist with wolves. And Craig is going to talk today about how he is doing that and how Defenders of Wildlife specifically does that. I'm going to do a quick introduction for Craig. Craig is Defenders Senior Southwest Representative. He has led Defenders Regional Wolf and Jaguar Conservation Programs since 1993. He's also served on federal recovery teams for the Cactus ferruginous pygmy owl and the gray wolf. He's the founder or co-founder of the Northern Jaguar Project. Craig has been active in Southwest conservation issues since 1987. Craig has a BS in Public Administration and Natural Resources from NAU and is an alumnus of Lesley College Graduate School and the National Audubon Society Expedition Institute. So before I let Craig take it away with his slideshow, I'm going to just mention that for some logistics, after Craig's presentation, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. I will monitor those questions and we'll open it up at the end, and I will ask those questions or answer those questions depending on which is more appropriate. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Craig and put myself on mute for his presentation. Thank you, Craig. And I'll just mention we have 130 participants, so this is excellent.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for being here. And thank you, Brian, for the gracious introduction and background. I want to start by just sharing just sort of a brief description of my experience with Mexican gray wolves before I get into where we're at today. Back in the mid-1980s, I was traveling with a group called the Audubon Expedition Institute. We had done a backpack in the mountains of Tucson, and this area it was very remote, but also had a long history of extreme anti-predator prejudice and activities. And some of you, if you've been around long enough, may recall an image of many mountain lion heads stacked up in a pyramid. Well, many of those, most of those were killed in and around Aravaipa Canyon. And at that time, I was unaware of Defenders of Wildlife. However, during that trip and soon after, I learned that Aravaipa Canyon at the north end of the Galliero mountain range was in fact owned by this curious organization based in Washington, D.C., who had strong beliefs about the inherent value of wildlife. And here they were, kind of this bastion of conservation in a relatively hostile environment, and piqued my curiosity. A few weeks after that, our ecology study group was out camping in the Sonoran Desert west of Tucson. And it was at that time that I had my first wolf howl experience, and quite different than I think most experiences, in that howl came from captive animals in a captive breeding facility. And I later learned that one of the last wild wolves in Arizona had been documented in Aravaipa Canyon, the area we had just previously visited. At that time, there were just a few dozen Mexican wolves remaining in captivity, and I'll come back to that story in just a moment. But soon after that, through some Sierra Club outreach work, I met a woman who was beginning a citizen-based initiative to help educate and motivate the public to act on behalf of Mexican gray wolf recovery. And the group was called Preserve Arizona's Wolves, and Bobby Holliday gets all the credit for pulling that together. And in my opinion, we would not have wolves on the ground if it weren't for that initiative. But I quickly joined that initiative, and a couple years later, I found myself meeting with Defenders of Wildlife Board of Directors and President at the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum. And I've been working with Defenders of Wildlife pretty much ever since for the past 30 years. Defenders of Wildlife is a national wildlife conservation organization, and we are dedicated to the protection of all native plants and wild and animals in their natural communities, regardless of their utilitarian value to humans. That doesn't mean it isn't important. That isn't the primary reason why we do what we do. In fact, much of the work that we do involves collaborative solutions with different human communities and helping to address conflicts between humans and wildlife. But we really pursue wildlife conservation because of the inherent value of wildlife for its own right. Mexican gray wolves are one of the rarest forms of life on the planet. In fact, one of the rarest wolves on the planet. You can't get closer to extinction than having one female remaining in the wild, and that is the story of Mexican gray wolves. For the previous 150 years, there was a federal extermination campaign on behalf of settlers and ranchers, and enacted in part by the federal government, using trapping and poisoning and shooting. We almost forced this magnificent creature into extinction. In the late 1970s, the last handful of Mexican gray wolves, the last 5, had been live captured in northern Mexico. They had been exterminated from their U.S. portion of their range, and those animals were the beginning of a captive breeding program. Now, fortunately, there were a couple of others who had been previously captured and held in captive facilities in other locations, and they were eventually combined to form a captive breeding program to prevent Mexican gray wolves from disappearing entirely. The Arizona Sonora Desert Museum was one of the first facilities to host Mexican gray wolves, and continues to play an important role in education and outreach and building support for wolves and wildlife and conservation and appreciation of nature in general, and still remains very close to my heart. Today, there are about approximately 45 captive breeding facilities between the US and Mexico. There's an intensive and carefully managed breeding program to maximize the genetic diversity within the captive population, to reduce the likelihood of inbreeding depression and all of the problems that can come from that. And as you might imagine, with only 7 founding individuals, there are significant concerns about the lack of genetic diversity in the captive population. And I'll come back to that when we talk about wolves in the wild, because that's an even more pronounced concern for wild lobos, which have even less genetic representation of the original founders. Prior to reintroduction, it was essential to determine whether or not any wild wolves might remain in the wild lands of US and Mexico. And the group PAWS and Arizona Game and Fish Department worked together to conduct howling surveys throughout the historic range in the region. Along the US-Mexico border region, long before there was a border wall, we would conduct howling surveys throughout the night. And as a result, the Blue Range, the area around the Blue Range primitive area in eastern Arizona was eventually selected as one of the best potential sites to host a reintroduction, in part because of the habitat characteristics and relevance to historic range, and also how it might fit into a bigger picture vision of recovery down the road relative to other intact habitats in the region. At one point, there were 15 sites, narrowed down to 11, then narrowed down to 4 that were considered for eventual reintroduction, and the Blue Range primitive area was selected. Now, concurrent with those howling surveys and a substantial public education and outreach program, there were dozens upon dozens of public meetings held by federal agencies, primarily U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Arizona Game and Fish Department throughout Arizona and New Mexico and Texas. And as you might imagine, sentiments around wolf recovery and the potential impacts to agricultural communities, particularly through the loss of livestock, were very strong. And on the other side of the equation, conservationists and the general public had increasing sentiment in favor of conservation. You know, the Endangered Species Act had been passed. The public had a growing interest in protecting, preserving, restoring wildlife and habitats while we still had the opportunity. And these public meetings were really a show of force by interests on all sides of the issue. At the end of the day, the decision was made to proceed with reintroduction. In 1998, I had the privilege of witnessing the return of one of the most endangered land mammals in the world. On the right there, you'll see maybe a familiar face. That is former Arizona Governor and former Secretary of Interior, Bruce Babbitt. On the left is Jamie Clark. At the time, Jamie was the director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Today, she is the president and CEO of Defenders of Wildlife. And the woman to the back here is Trish Stevenson, which may not sound familiar, but it may sound familiar if I told you that was Aldo Leopold's granddaughter. And for those of you who don't know, Aldo Leopold is recognized as one of the catalysts for modern day conservation thinking. He was one of the first forest rangers in the American Southwest. Back in the day, in the early 1900s, he's credited for shooting into a pack of wolves and watching the green fire die in the breeding female's eyes, and wrote sort of an epiphany-like story about how that was a transformational moment for him. And as he evolved in his thinking and ethics, went on to popularize the importance of predators in natural systems, thinking like a mountain, the land ethic, etc. I had, back in my college days, Sand County Almanac, one of Leopold's compilation of essays, was required reading. So it was really powerful for me to be able to participate in the restoration of one of the most persecuted animals in the world, and to have the relevance and the connection with Leopold in the very area where he fired into the pack and watched the green fire extinguished. We now have essentially reignited the green fire, and not just symbolically. This is actually very close to where the Wallow Fire was started several years ago. In fact, just across the Black River, within a couple of miles of where the initial releases took place. Of course, it wasn't a matter of just opening the gates and releasing wolves. And I should mention, in the previous picture, when the wolves were brought into the acclimation pens, they weren't just released. There was a 2-month acclimation period. So the first family groups, there were 3 family groups, are carried into acclimation pens, and Defenders of Wildlife and the Phoenix Zoo provided volunteer guardians, we call them wolf guardians, who camped out for the first 2 months of acclimation for those wolves while they were in their acclimation pens, assisting with supplemental feeding, meaning bringing roadkill. And because these were captive animals, they would take the roadkill and prop it up right and hold it up with branches so that the wolves would associate with upright, elk and deer, etc. They would conduct perimeter checks to provide security for the wolves, and just monitor for their well-being. And so what we're celebrating this month really is the opening of the gates. So they were brought into the acclimation pens in January. The actual gates on the acclimation pens were opened in late March, I think March 29th. Dave Parsons, former U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biologist who authored the initial reintroduction plan, and Dan Grubner, who authored a similar plan on behalf of Arizona Game and Fish Department, were the two hardy biologists who snuck out there in the peak of an unlikely snowstorm in March and opened the gates, and were able to free El Lobo after, as I mentioned, an extensive campaign. But it wasn't just a matter of opening the gates. Many of the factors that contributed to the demise of wolves still persisted. At the time, the number of livestock grazing on public lands between Arizona and New Mexico ranged between 2.1 and 2.5 million cows. And that's a significant concern. And so defenders particularly, but other organizations as well, were as proactive as we could be in getting out and meeting with ranchers and having discussions about, if reintroduction were to occur, what would it take to live with the wolf? And of course, conversations in the early years revolved around the notion of, no wolves, no way, we're going to dig in and fight this to the bitter end. But once wolves were on the ground, it became pretty clear that we needed to figure out ways to work together. And slowly we were able to develop partnership projects with ranchers on the ground to help reduce the vulnerability to wolf depredation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But one of the programs that we initiated is a range rider type program where we sponsor young cowboys and cowgirls to learn about wolf behavior and to work primarily through the summer, during the summer grazing season, to increase eyes and ears on wolves and livestock, and to work primarily on the livestock end of the equation by reducing vulnerability through things like herding and helping to inspire livestock to bunch together in the presence of threats by predators, to increase human presence, particularly during vulnerable times of the year like calving season, to look for things like carcasses and remove them because they can serve as an attractant in luring wolves and bears and lions into calving pastures or other areas where they may get in trouble. And these partnerships have evolved in some cases to the point where we're implementing new ideas and new tools annually. Every year I think we get better and more effective, and the partnerships get stronger as we confront new challenges and have success with new approaches. I like to say that there are a lot of tools that we can use to reduce conflicts between wolves and livestock, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of those. But by far the best tool is the human mind. And the best way to use the human mind is by connecting with others with diverse experience and diverse perspectives and trying to collaboratively troubleshoot. And that's really what's behind our range rider type partnerships with producers as well as with agency managers. And hand in hand with that comes the trust and a sense of shared responsibility for solving the problems and reducing the conflict and increasing the conservation benefits. Regardless of what tools you use, whether it's air horns or strobe lights or rubber bullets or condensing calving season, there will continue to be some livestock depredations. But my experience has been that the tools are far less important than the partnerships that evolve around the use and experimentation of those tools and experimentation with different management strategies. And so that's a priority, and we do as best as we can. And I'll be honest, I've burned a few bridges over the years. I've made some bad mistakes in our relationships with some key landowners and key ranchers, because the reality is we're coming from very different places. But we've also helped to develop some very solid partnerships that I think have been quite valuable in forwarding conservation for Mexican wolves. One of the tools that can be effective in some circumstances is the use of fladry. Fladry is really these flags that are attached to an electric poly wire that creates a visual deterrent. And for whatever reason, wolves are pretty cautious. They don't particularly like the flags blowing in the wind, and they're reluctant to cross that line. And when you double that up with an electric wire, it kind of doubles the negative reinforcement. Sometimes to get started, we'll hang a little chunk of meat on the electric wire so that if wolves are in the area, they might take a bite and get a non-injurious charge, but they'll understand that, we're trying to communicate to them that it's in their best interest to pursue native prey and stay away from domestic livestock. One of the problems with fladry, though, is that it is a little labor intensive to set up first, and there's a little bit of capital involved, and defenders cost shares on the purchase of the equipment, and in some cases in the placement of the fladry, providing labor. But the rancher really has to be committed to wanting this to work, because it does require consistent maintenance. Particularly up in the White Mountains, we get strong winds, the flags blow, they'll wrap around the poly wire and they lose their effectiveness. So once a week or so, you've got to hike the line and unwind the fladry. And we've experimented with different designs with varying degrees of success. But that's one of the tools that is kind of one of the more visible tools in the landscape. And perhaps the only one that's more visible is the dancing doll. We've got a variety of names for this one, but the scare device, use that in limited situations on private lands, primarily in a situation where wolves are being drawn to a ranch house, either out of interest in the ranch dogs or because of some other attractant. And again, they can be effective in limited circumstances. We're not advocating that we place dancing dolls, on public lands, across the forest. But it's an example of something that can work under the right circumstances. Another tool that can be quite effective is a little device like this. This is called a fox light. It was originally designed to replicate human presence. I've got a little video clip I'll show you, by emitting a random strobe light to replicate a flashlight or a handheld strobe, which implies human presence. And there are other things that wildlife managers and wildlife technicians and ranch hands can do to non-injuriously communicate to the wolves that people are present. And again, it's best to pursue the elk and stay away from the cattle. Air horns also can be quite an effective tool. They're quite annoying, and combined with a high intensity strobe light, they can send quite a powerful message to the wolves, and it doesn't take long for them to learn. Either they're so annoyed, or they risk other potential deterrents by hanging out, that they move on. Starters, pistols, cracker shells, or rubber bullets. There's a variety of non-lethal munitions that can be fired from a shotgun that are non-injurious, but they certainly serve as a deterrent to help keep wolves out of trouble. This is just an example. You all have seen flashlights before. This particular one's about a 20,000 lumen strobe, so it can be seen for quite a distance. But I just wanted to demonstrate how the fox lights replicate human presence. And after wolves have had encounters with humans, in a variety of forms. If they associate the lights with human presence, then these fox lights can serve as a surrogate for range riders or for wildlife technicians or for human presence. Now, they're not going to be effective in perpetuity, and you can't just stick them out in a pasture and expect them to keep wolves away. They have to be used in conjunction with human presence, which requires, changing the way livestock are managed. Prior to wolves, it was very common to just bring livestock out, particularly in the higher elevations in the summer season, and not see them that often until, either you're checking waters or repairing fence line, and then pick them up in the fall to cross the scale. And that's really not an appropriate way to raise cattle in the presence of wolves. And that's one of the reasons for our proactive work, is to help not only identify the tools and management strategies that can help reduce vulnerability, but to put them into place and to demonstrate success and to inspire those involved in agriculture to share their successes with their neighbors and their relatives throughout the community. And we've seen a measured growth in the adoption of a variety of conflict prevention tools. Back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, we had exactly ranchers who were willing to work with defenders on conflict reduction strategies, and one in Arizona and one in New Mexico. And today, just through the defender supported projects, we're providing about 24, 25 range riders per season, in addition to an equal number of wildlife technicians, or support for wildlife technicians, which I'll describe in a moment. As I mentioned, another strategy is to remove carcasses from the landscape, or render their carcasses inedible through treating them with lime or covering them with black plastic so that they putrefy quickly, don't smell, don't attract, bigger problems down the road. And I will say I'm pretty encouraged that this year, Arizona Game and Fish, in partnership with the Arizona Livestock Loss Board, initiated a carcass removal incentive program for ranchers in wolf occupied areas, where they will receive a payment. I believe it's $250 per carcass for removing it away from wolf activity, and in part to avert a conflict down the road. Now, I'm encouraged by that, not to further subsidize public lands. I'm encouraged because it reflects adoption of proactive management and non-lethal management by a wildlife management agency. Years ago, when we were experiencing some of these tools, we thought, and were convinced, and remain convinced today, that the only way these projects will be successful is if they become sort of normal behavior, normalized, and we say institutionalized, meaning that agencies, from Game and Fish departments to the Forest Service to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, eventually adopt and place more emphasis on non-lethal, non-invasive approaches to preventing conflicts and managing wolves and wildlife. And so the carcass removal incentive, in that sense, reflects pretty big step forward. Another activity that we support is experience sharing, peer-to-peer experience sharing. In this particular instance, we hosted ranchers from the Southwest to come meet with ranchers in the Northern Rockies who had good experience, good success in managing their cattle in a way to reduce conflicts with both wolves and grizzly bears through things like herding and teaching your cattle to mother up, meaning keep your calves close when they're the most vulnerable, and particularly in the presence of predators, and using dogs, cattle dogs, to apply different levels of pressure on the cattle so that they learn to stand their ground, but not too much pressure so that they break off into a run and incite a chase and eventual depredations. So there are all kinds of tricks from a livestock management perspective that aren't going to be perceived as legitimate if an urban environmentalist like myself is telling a rancher, what they should and shouldn't be doing. That isn't the approach that we take. But when we find ranchers who have had success in other regions, we do everything we can to help share that experience in a non-condescending way to help identify tools and strategies that may be helpful and more appropriate in the Southwest. And that has paid big conservation dividends. It's kind of an uninteresting picture until you look closely at it. In this picture, this is from a ranch just on the eastern side of the White Mountain Apache tribe, right in the heart of Mexican wolf country. We've got a couple of cows here with calves. And if you look closely, you'll see 4 wolves, 3 bedded down in the grass. And ideally, we don't want wolves and cattle mixing it up, but everything's happening. Everything in this picture is happening the way we prefer it to happen if they are interacting. These cows are not breaking off into a run. They're not acting excited. They're not getting the wolves excited. The cows stand their ground. You'll notice one is grazing while the other one is keeping watch sort of between the calf and the wolves. And that's actually what we want. We want the wolves to know that these cattle are confident enough to stand their ground, and they certainly can. And wolves are smart. I mean, you think about the smartest dog and I've seen YouTube videos where a dog can fetch a can of beer out of the fridge. Dogs are smart, and magnify that a dozen times. Wolves are about as smart as a canid can be, and they understand that if they attack a full-grown, healthy adult bull or cow, or even a healthy bull elk, they risk breaking a jaw or breaking a rib, and they know that with that kind of an injury, they aren't going to be able to hunt successfully and feed the pack. And so they look for opportunities. They look for a weakness, slow, sick, weak, injured ungulates before moving in to isolate an animal from a herd and make the kill. It's not the case 100% of the time, but that is general wolf hunting strategy. And that's why wolves help promote the genetic vigor of ungulate herds. It's by culling the slower, sicker, weaker, injured, older individuals. It helps promote the strength of the herd. But by understanding wolf behavior and particularly hunting strategies, you can adopt livestock management accordingly to reduce the vulnerability and to your herds so that they have the most appropriate behavior possible to reduce the likelihood of depredations. And so we provide support for training of range riders and ranch owners if they're interested in taking it to that level in understanding predator-prey relationships and how it can be integrated into a ranch management. On the other end of the equation, the range riders focus primarily on livestock management, but on the other end of the equation is wolf management. And I think the most effective approach is deal with all the factors in the equation. We support a wildlife technician internship, basically a practicum for younger kids coming out of college with degrees in biology or veterinary science or natural resource management, where they can get hands-on experience in managing wolves and implementing non-lethal conflict reduction tools and management strategies, and provide on-the-ground assistance to state and federal wildlife agencies. So these technicians are out there, boots on the ground, doing the hard work day after day, monitoring wolves, using telemetry equipment, trying to verify dens, assisting with cross-fostering of pups. Cross-fostering is a strategy that's currently used to help increase the genetic diversity of the wild population, which involves taking genetically valuable pups born in captivity and slipping them into wild-born litters out in Arizona and New Mexico, so that those pups can be raised with pups that have different genetic compositions to help diversify the population. It's a really labor-intensive procedure, potentially very valuable. I think to date, there have been 14 cross-fostered pups that have documented as survived and could potentially be contributing their valuable genes back into the wild population. We support cross-fostering. It's extremely important to help diversify the genetics of the wild population, given, as I mentioned previously, the number of founding individuals. There are also significant genetic concerns just beyond the low number of founding animals, in that there's greater genetic diversity in the captive population than there is in the wild population. And the longer the wild population grows, and the more it grows with limited genetics, and in fact, with a high degree of relatedness between wild individuals. In fact, the degree of relatedness is the equivalent of brothers and sisters for most of the wolves in the wild population. Having said that, the population today has increased significantly, and we celebrate that. We've gone from having 0 in the wild as recently as 1997 to having 241 wolves, which is what we're celebrating today. It's a significant increase in the population. And there's a lot of hard work that's gone into that, both on behalf of the agencies and the NGOs and the captive breeding facility cooperators, and dozens of other organizations and countless hundreds of individuals who've volunteered their time over the years to get us to that point. But the population number in and of itself can be deceiving. In some sense, the larger the population gets without significant diversification of the genes in that population, the bigger the problem becomes and the more difficult it will be to resolve down the road. And this is where we get into a little bit of a disagreement, you could say, with state and some federal managers, in that the goal that they're pursuing for recovery is, while it acknowledges the importance of genetic diversity of the wild population, the metrics that are in place don't actually require a certain level of genetic diversity of the wild population. They simply measure the amount of effort that's put into it. For example, with regard to cross-fostering, the states and Fish and Wildlife Service currently, under the current recovery plan and rule, believe that 22 cross-fostered pups that reach the age of breeding maturity is sufficient enough to back away from cross-fostering and augmenting the wild population. That may be true, but it also may not. A couple of things to consider. Those cross-fostered pups have to survive to breeding age, which is a minimum of 2 years old. There's a 50% or greater average mortality for pups in the wild every year. Those pups that are cross-fostered not only have to survive to breeding age, but they have to breed, and they have to breed successfully. And they have to breed successfully with the right wolves. Keep in mind, some of these cross-fostered pups also have siblings from captivity that are cross-fostered. And if those siblings mate, we don't get the same genetic benefits as we would if they mated with pups from other lineages. So there are a lot of unknowns, and what we're advocating is that there be a genomic metric for the wild population before endangered species protections be removed for this vulnerable population. There's a lot more to this. Brian mentioned at the beginning of the talk that Dr. Phil Hedrick, one of the foremost geneticists who's been involved with Mexican wolf captive breeding and recovery since before I've been involved, long before I've been involved, really brilliant guy, will be giving a talk in early April, and I highly encourage you all to participate in that. That said, we cooperate and invest resources and do the best we can to make cross-fostering successful. We also work collaboratively with the tribe, particularly White Mountain Apache tribe, to help both in bringing resources and supporting training and helping to develop programs that might provide additional sources of income, particularly for livestock association members or outfitters or guides who feel like they may be displaced by a growing wolf population. Working with tribal livestock associations and managers to find ways to help not only reduce the potential negative impacts of wolves, but potentially maximize the benefits. One program that we've supported over the years and got put on a little hiatus because of COVID is a tribal youth wolf conservation program, which will be reinitiated again this season, which employs young tribal members during the summer to get hands-on experience, similar to the wildlife technician practicum that we support. This provides employment for young tribal members in the field of natural resource management and hopefully leads to longer-term meaningful employment. It also gives tribal resource managers an opportunity to find out who may or may not be an ideal fit as the program expands. On the subject of recovery, this is a little publication that Defenders put together to help sort of visualize what we think recovery should look like. One important point here is that historically, there was a continuum of gray wolves from central Mexico all the way up to the Yukon, down the spine of the continent into the American Southwest. And that was established by multiple waves of gray wolves coming across from Eurasia, across the Bering Land Bridge, and dispersing down into the Southwest. What's interesting about Mexican gray wolves is they are believed to be the oldest gray wolves in North America. They are the descendants of the first wave of gray wolves. And as subsequent waves of gray wolves came across the land bridge, Bailey moved further and further south. But the point is, historically, there was a continuum of gray wolves. And gray wolves, having dispersal potential of several hundred miles, frequently interbred between different varieties of wolves. Now, we've put the title, subspecies on the title, Mexican gray wolf. And we believe that the current approach to recovery is a little behind, it's lagging a little behind the science, which is based on what was considered the best available science back in the 80s, which is taxonomy based on morphological measurements or skull measurements and specimens collected on a landscape. About 60 wolf specimens remaining of the several thousands that used to roam the Southwest. And based on that sort of skeletal depiction of distribution of gray wolves, we put together what was considered a probable historic range. But since then, the thinking about wolf dispersal, historic distribution, and what's required for recovery has evolved. And we're hopeful and advocating that the agencies will pay closer attention to the new science that is continuing to be published and be open to considering the value of restoring that continuum of gray wolves. Particularly in the case of Mexican wolves, it would be beneficial to manage for some genetic introgression, some genetic interchange with different varieties of gray wolves further north. And I'll leave it at that. Dr. Hedrick will be able to address that in much greater detail. And getting close to wrapping up here, I just wanted to demonstrate here that, this doesn't have to be the cultural war that is often depicted in the media. There are many things that we share with agricultural communities, rural families, and the approach that we're taking is by finding that common ground, sharing the resources to implement programs that uphold the values that we hold in common, which is primarily open space, wildlife, and related values associated with preserving wild nature and meeting our production needs at the same time. In my opinion, we cannot achieve recovery at an ecologically meaningful scale, meaning something more than a minimum viable population, unless we're successful at helping wolves and helping agricultural communities better live together. And ecologically meaningful scale means having multiple populations of wolves across in suitable areas across the landscape with intermittent connectivity so that they can exchange genes, but also so that they can occur in a density that restores the ecological processes that are responsible for creating and maintaining the beautiful landscape in the Southwest that most of us hold dear.
Craig, we're going to
I'm
take
done.
Thank you so much, Craig Miller. That was fascinating. Your incredible experience of over 25 years of working alongside this recovery program is we're so lucky to get to hear about that. And your depth of knowledge is just invaluable. So thank you. We are going to spend the last 10 minutes here with some questions. We got some really great questions. I've tried to answer a few of them in the chat, in the Q&A, but I'm going to go ahead and answer these in the order they came in. So we got a question, and the first question is a little long. I'm going to read it. I'm interested in the impacts of the recent wildfires and climate change on the current and potential suitable range. Also, any efforts to get wolves across I-40 and I-10 to improve connectivity with other suitable habitat and populations?
Are you going to take that one?
No, you go ahead if you want. It's so
You know,
how is climate change affecting the species and then connectivity?
yeah, okay. And I think you led with a question about fire, because we've had substantial fires, which, you know, arguably is an outcome of climate change. And we've had significant fires blow through wolf country. And fortunately, on sort of the top level, wolves have been pretty successful at avoiding direct injury from the fires. But on another level, I think they've benefited significantly for a couple of reasons. One, the big fires ultimately result in road closures. And so in many cases, it increases habitat security for wolves for several years until those roads are either recreated or deemed safe, in part because there's a lot of standing dead timber in areas that have been burned out. So the forest restricts access until those areas are either cleaned out or, as I mentioned, less of a liability. And then on sort of an ecological level, the fires have had a significant benefit to native vegetation recruitment, particularly aspens. The aspens tend to respond to fire quite well, growing back in high, thick density, and that contributes both to habitat security and improved conditions for elk, and in other cases, elk and deer, which we expect to continue to rebound in the presence of these improving habitat conditions. So from my unbiased perspective, fire has had a net benefit on wolves. What was the second part of the question? Interstate 40.
Well, just whether there is any efforts to get reconnect the habitat on the different sides of I-40 and I-10.
Yeah, so good questions. Yeah, in the map that I showed previously, and the reconnection or the restoration of wolves on that continuum across the West would require wolves to be able to move freely between habitats south of Interstate 40, north of Interstate 40, and south of Interstate 10. It's not only a nice thing to do, but it's essential for restoring the flow of genes between subpopulations that will likely be reestablished in those areas. Wolves have demonstrated consistent interest in moving up into the area around the San Francisco Peaks, north of Williams, across the Mogollon Rim. We call it the Mogollon Wildway, which if managed in a way that's conducive to predator dispersal, could be a significant wolf runway, I guess is the historic term for wolves moving between would-be populations. The two best areas remaining in the American West for Mexican gray wolves, according to some of the best, foremost scientists, population ecologists, and based on modeling, are the Grand Canyon ecoregion and the area around the border of northern Mexico and southern Colorado, Carson National Forest. They looked at factors like road density, water availability, native prey abundance, projected human build out, and ran hundreds of thousands of simulations to determine how these areas may contribute to Mexican wolf survival in the long run, and along with evaluating and comparing them to other areas throughout the region and in Mexico. And those two, head and shoulders above the rest, stand out as the last best places for Mexican gray wolves. And not only are they important for wolf survival, but they could benefit from the return of wolves and the ecological role that they historically played. These are areas that evolved in the presence of wolves, and with the benefit of top-level regulation, which has the effect of promoting not only the vigor of native prey species, but by checking herbivory and regulating the time of exposure of native ungulates and their impacts on grasses and forbs, can have the benefit of increasing things like aspen and willow and cottonwood regeneration. And when they're allowed to grow to a certain height above sort of the browse line, they can cast shade in a good way on streams and lower water temperatures and provide benefits for native aquatic species like threatened Apache trout and Gila trout, which need cool waters, as opposed to some of our introduced sport fish that thrive in warmer waters. And they help reduce erosion, and on and on and on.
Greg, I want to try to get to two more questions quickly if we can. One is, you spoke about how to keep wolves away from ranchers, but to what extent are ranchers encroaching on the territory of wolves? Is that a problem? Are there strategies to correct that?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, there has been some success, particularly by the group Wild Earth Guardians, in retiring a grazing allotment that is important, has been important to wolves for many years. The Deep Creek allotment in the Gila National Forest, I think, is a good example of a proactive effort, proactive action to help relieve the potential conflict between wolves and ranching. And there are other ecological reasons, I think, why that retirement took place. But that's an example of how we might be more proactive to reduce potential conflicts in the future. I believe that the ideal scenario would be to have strategic allotments that have limited livestock or livestock use managed sporadically, so that wolves have places where they're allowed to be wolves without the concern or potential nuisance of interactions with livestock. Not advocating for that anywhere, but I think it's important, like particularly around den sites and rendezvous sites, which wolves tend to use year after year, that we reduce livestock presence in those areas and perhaps work to help relocate those operations in areas where there are fewer opportunities for conflict.
One last question. Other than donating, is there any work that people can do remotely to assist these efforts?
Yeah, you know, this is a dynamic program, and there are always decisions that affect the day-to-day management of the program, as well as sort of the long-term vision for recovery. I think one of the best ways to stay engaged is, you know, you can visit Defenders of Wildlife, our Mexican Wolf site, or any one of the partner groups that we work with, particularly MexicanWolves.org. That is an area where multiple organizations kind of share our ideas about threats and needs to help keep the program on course toward recovery. If you want to, it's very good at identifying sort of up and coming public decision-making processes where you can get involved, you can share your concerns. If you're a scientist, you can help identify where you may be able to contribute. It really depends on, you know, your suite of skills and interests but there are a myriad of opportunities seemingly all the time to plug in and help keep this program moving forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Craig. And thank you to everybody who joined us today. It was a really great webinar, and we aren't going to be able to do any more questions. But if you want to get in touch with either Craig or myself, visit defenders.org and go to where we work and hit the Southwest program. And Craig and I's contact information is both there. Our emails are easy. It's just our first initial last name at defenders.org. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Craig. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.